week's lecture. In lieu of a normal lecture, I am going to be interviewing one of the co-authors of the paper that I assigned for this week, namely Emily Sullivan. Dr. Emily Sullivan is an assistant professor of philosophy at Eindhoven University, which is in the Netherlands. And she and I actually have worked together for a few years. In fact, I'm one of the co-authors on this paper with her, along with several other people. Emily, thanks for joining us. I really appreciate your time.
Yeah, hey, thanks for having me.
Cool. So this paper appears in the Oxford Studies in Experimental Philosophy volume, and the paper title is actually a question. So the question is, can real social epistemic networks deliver the wisdom of crowds? That's kind of a mouthful. Can I ask you to walk us through the main concepts there? So like, for instance, what is the wisdom of crowds in the first place?
Yeah, so the wisdom of crowds is a theory that says that crowds can converge on like truth or better answers than individuals can. So the classic example of the wisdom of crowds is that you have like a jar of jelly beans, and then people need to guess how many jelly beans there are in the jar. I actually did this as a kid and I got it right and I got a free sweatshirt. But that's usually people are very bad at this, right? But if you, like individuals, but if you survey a group of individuals and then like average their answers, then the average of the group's answer is actually very close to how many jelly beans there are in the jar. So this is a case where groups can converge on the truth better than a particular individual. So that's like the wisdom of crowds idea generally. You can also see this, that there's this kind of tendency in like juries. So if you have more 12 jury members, right, they might can converge on better answers than just if there was one jury member or something like this. So in this paper, we're kind of taking that hypothesis to, well, the internet is this huge crowd of information sharers, right? Can the internet deliver us this kind of wisdom where the crowd's behaviors can like aggregate or converge on the truth in a better, more reliable way than just an individual might?
Yeah, so I guess one of the interesting things with the wisdom of crowds literature and the proofs that have been developed around it is this idea that even non-experts, if you get enough of them together, do a better job than one or two experts on their own. So it sort of suggests that there's some kind of information in groups, even amateur groups, that it can be quite valuable. Are crowds always wise, or are there constraints on what it takes for a crowd to be wise?
Yeah, so there are constraints that they talk about. So one is that the people need to be independent from each other in some important sense. So I guess in the jelly bean case, right, if everyone discussed beforehand how many jelly beans were in the jar, then they would all give the same answer, and then it would just be as bad as just the one person guessing, right? Because you don't get that independence from each other. You also need to have diversity. So they need to have, right, again, different answers. So if everyone gave the same answer, then you wouldn't have a diverse set of answers. So those are two things in particular that you need to have in a crowd to make sure that that it harnesses the wisdom of it. Yeah,
so I guess the idea would be like, if everyone just took their guess from one other individual, then you would get 100 of the same guesses. And of course, if you average those, that's not going to be any different from the first guess in the first place.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about what you understand by diversity here? So is it like different demographic backgrounds, or different training, or different methodological standards or all of the above?
Yeah, so I think that the diversity aspect in the wisdom of crowds, I mean, it has a lot to be explored, right? Because it can mean so many different things. So it can mean all the things that you mentioned, and it's presumably the more diverse you have on all those scores, the better, right? In our research, we're focusing on like diversity of viewpoints. So making sure that people have different stances or views towards a certain kind of topic. But they might also have like different reasons in favor of or against a certain, whether or not vaccines are safe, for example. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so it's sort of a weird thing because I guess people sometimes talk about this in terms of the Overton window. So like if you're having a debate about how to organize your society, do you really want to bring to the table the fascists? Because it's a different viewpoint. Like maybe we should hear them out. Or if you're thinking about like whether slavery is acceptable, do you really want to bring the slaveholders to the table? Like at a certain point, you might think, well, diversity of viewpoint is no longer valuable. It's actually undermining things. But do you think there's any like principled way of saying, okay, we go this diverse and no more?
I mean,
It's
that's
a hard question.
yeah, I mean, this is a really hard question. I mean, is there a principled way to say this diverse and no more? I mean, there are probably proposals that you can make, but are they the right proposals? I mean, we talk a little bit at the end of the paper that people need to be entering in the discussion in good faith, right? So if people are just trolls or sea lining or just like trying to be difficult and trying to put forward these arguments, not because they think they have any merit, but just to be a troublemaker, right? Then we shouldn't include those into our discussion because they're not actually deliberation partners, right? They're not trying to deliberate. They're just trying to undermine the conversation.
Yeah, undermine the conversation or maybe redirect interest or redirect attention or something like this. I encountered something like this last year when I ended up tussling with this guy who argued in a philosophy journal paper that somehow managed to get through peer review that there should be racially segregated education again. And it became quite clear to me that he wasn't actually offering reasons. He was just sort of pretending to do so in order to stir up controversy. But then the problem, I guess, goes up a level, and you might wonder like, well, okay, if you want to say that someone's not arguing in good faith, then you have to give evidence for that. And if they are at least pretending to give reasons, it can be very difficult to make that assessment.
Yeah, I mean, so I think with a lot of these things, it's hard to know. So it's hard to know what's going on. So you can have this kind of idealized like epistemic theory that says like these are the people to listen to under these conditions, but in reality, are you going to be able to know whether someone meets those conditions if it has any kind of internal aspect to it? So the internal aspect might be their intentions or what they believe, for example. So if they have to believe that it's true, like you can't really access that information. So I think one of the values of the approach that we take in this paper is that we're just looking at these kinds of formal structures. So we're not looking at like internal states or trying to guess what people on Twitter, why they share the information that they do, but just the information that comes your way. Does that mean that you're likely to be in an epistemic position if you were to take that information as being true?
Yeah, so I guess that takes us to the rest of the title. So it's about real epistemic, social epistemic networks as opposed to idealized ones. And I guess the jelly bean example is kind of a nice illustration of an idealized network, because what you've got there is like everyone independently steps up to the jar, scrutinizes it, has a think, writes down their number, their guess, and then all of those are aggregated and you take the average of them. But in real networks, that kind of parallel processing doesn't typically happen. So like one person will be the first to speak and then others hear them and those others then respond, and they might bring their own private information to bear, but they're also influenced by what they heard previously. And some voices get amplified a lot more than others. So can you say a little bit about why focusing on these kinds of non-ideal real networks can be helpful for understanding epistemology of the internet, or contemporary epistemology where we're dealing with imperfect networks and connections?
Yeah, so yeah, I think there's a lot of value in studying this like in a theoretical sense of building. So another way of getting at the same kind of problem is by doing like this type of like agent-based modeling, where you actually build like a toy model with like built-in assumptions, and then you see how the network responds. So that has a really nice value in seeing like what might be like potential difference makers. So the way that I think about toy models in epistemology and in science in general is a way of getting certain hypotheses, right, that we can then test in the real world, right? And without that kind of connection from the theoretical model to the real world, then the model itself is going to only have so much epistemic value. So by looking at these kind of non-idealized cases, we can use them as a kind of test case to the kind of hypotheses that come out of these theoretical models. But then also there might be some interesting patterns that emerge that you can then build into another theoretical model to kind of play around with what that might influence in these kind of ideal cases, and then just kind of take a circle going back and forth to try to get closer to how it actually works on the internet, right?
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of value to that, because I mean, a lot of these early agent-based models that were developed by people like Kevin Zollman, there's a small number of agents, and the ways that they're connected to each other are not reflective of that actual human connection. So, you've got cases where it's like everyone's connected to everyone else. And we know that doesn't happen, certainly on a network as big as the internet, or networks where there's one agent who's like the hub and everyone's connected to the hub and not to anyone else. And we know that that's not how life works either. And then he's got other ones where there's like a ring where like everyone has two connections, and if you travel all the way around, you come back to where you started. And all of these things are like, well, I mean, that's a possible structure, but does it tell us anything about how actual human agents interact with each other? That starts to be a harder thing to make any inferences about. And I guess what we see in this paper, and what lots and lots of other researchers have tended to find, is that at least online, networks tend to be extremely polarized, where there's essentially just two groups, and each group has their own internal conversation that's dominated by a few influential nodes, and there's very little crosstalk between the groups. So what do you think is going on with these kind of polarized networks, and what can we learn from studying them?
Yeah, I mean, and just to take a step back first, the other thing that is important to think about too when we're talking about these real epistemic networks like on Twitter or Facebook or something, is that the the companies themselves, the platforms themselves, like develop algorithms to kind of promote certain content over other content and kind of put their thumb on the scale for how the network is actually structured, right? So one thing that's nice about looking at the data and seeing how these networks are structured and operated, then maybe you can, and seeing how badly they do epistemically, but maybe there are other ways of other types of algorithms that one could use to kind of promote epistemic values on these platforms instead of other values like just engagement or something like this. So, I mean, the fact that these conversations are very polarized, it could signal, right, that polarization topics are more likely to keep people on the platform or be engaged with the platform if they're, you know, talking with their own little community, right? So there was a study that did suggest that there are certain topics that people share more quickly, and these are topics that are often correlated with like fake news because they bring up high emotions or highly polarizing content. Yeah, I mean, so part of it is like, you mean you're not going to know whether or not these people didn't see the other side's content if they're just not interested in it? We don't know that aspect, but all we know is that they're not sharing it, right? They're not interested in it enough to press that kind of share button. So they're not taking the evidence of the other side as worthy of passing on, right?
Yeah, so I guess one issue that arises there is this question of like, what are these platforms optimized for? And you know, the business model for most of them is to sell advertising, and that means they need to keep people glued to their screens. So they're sort of optimized to capture and keep attention. And attention is a kind of epistemic phenomenon. Like, we attend to things that surprise us, that concern us, that worry us, and we're right to do so. I mean, if something is a genuine threat, you better pay attention. So there is a way in which these platforms are optimized for some kind of epistemic phenomenon, but you might think attention and knowledge are different, and sometimes we might be attending to things that aren't genuine threats but seem like it at first, and it's worth our while as individuals to attend to them, even though in the end it's not worth it for society to be kind of obsessed with them. Do you think the problem is in the business model, or the problem is in like how we regulate these things, or something else?
Well, so I think it's in both. So it's definitely in the business model. But and look, a lot of business models, right, if they're profit driven, there's going to be these conflicts of interest, right? Conflicts of interest between like public safety, like is a large one, right? So you need to have some kind of force pushing back, right, to make sure that it's in the company's interest to care about public safety in addition to profit. So it might be just as simple as, if everyone thinks this is unsafe, no one will buy it, and so then their profits go down. But when you are talking about what's happened with social media platforms like Facebook and Twitter, is that they just have gobbled up the whole space, right? So there is no other alternative, and these other platforms that are popping up to be an alternative, they have so much legwork to do. It's so much harder for them to get one user than it is for Facebook to maintain their users or to get another user. So part of their business model, right, is to keep people on the platform because that increases their profit shares, right? So there needs to be some kind of countervailing force to that, and that presumably could come from regulation. So I know there is another paper that you and I wrote together on this particular point. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, the monopoly status of Facebook in particular is really troubling, because if you throw together Facebook, WhatsApp, and Instagram, which they own, they've got something like, what is it, 80% of market share? So it's like, it's a monopoly, and we know that monopolies exploit people. So it does seem to me like that's one angle that's needed to understand this stuff. Unfortunately, our paper doesn't even have Facebook data because it's so hard to get data from them.
Yeah, I mean, so there's two sides to that, right? So the first side is that they are more protective of their data, but on the other hand, most people who are using Facebook are using it for private reasons, right? Whereas Twitter, you kind of sign away your privacy in the sense that all the tweets are in the public domain. So Facebook doesn't have that advantage. So it is harder for them to open up their platform. But it used to be that you were able to get data on public pages, but now, right, they've you can't get the data even on the public pages.
Yeah, unless you get the golden ticket, which some researchers get and others don't. And that's a whole other issue, because if they grant access only to people who are friendly to them, then the research that comes out of that is going to be very optimistic. Whereas if they granted it more widely, you might see some more negative findings. But yeah, let's return to the paper. So one of the main concepts that's used in this paper is the notion of Pagerank, which is named, I believe, after Larry Page, who was one of the founders of Google. Can you explain to us, to the students, what Pagerank is and why it would be a useful concept to employ in a study of the potential for wisdom of crowds in social networks?
Yeah, so PageRank is an algorithm that ranks. So, like you said, it's created by one of the people at Google. So it's ranking like web pages, right? So when you see like the Google's first page, when you type in a query, you have like these lists of web pages, right? And presumably, the higher you are on the list, the more relevant the information is, and the better quality that the information is. So PageRank is just one type of algorithm that you can use to rank these pages. And it's based off of the links between all the pages themselves. So often pages link to other pages. And so by analyzing that kind of page linking behavior, you can then kind of tease out importance. So PageRank is different because it's not just like a number of links. So if a page gets like 100 links from other different websites, that's one thing, but it also accounts for like the importance of the page. So if there's like some root page that the information came from first, then that one might be seen as more important, right? And then that one gets put higher, even if there are fewer people linking to it. So the example we give in the paper is that if the New York Times, which is an influential source, if that was to link to some local news source in some small town somewhere, that news source might get ranked higher than the New York Times, even though not that many people are linking to that small town newspaper, because for that particular story, that's the more important source that might get ranked higher for that query than the New York Times. So that's just how it works on like in a general level. And so once Google used something like PageRank, then their search results, they really saw a difference in their search results. I think to this day, they still use it in some way. Their algorithms are much more different and complicated, but I think they still use the underlying mechanisms of PageRank to some degree.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's right. So yeah, so just to back up and give a little bit of context for people who are not familiar with like network theory, There's lots of different so-called centrality metrics. And these are all basically used to figure out which nodes in a network are important. So like the most basic one is just like, how many links do you have? And that's called degree. But you might think, well, you might have a lot of links, but if they're all from disconnected nodes that get no attention, then they don't mean much, right? So like I could build myself a website and then build myself 100 other websites that all link to my first website, and no one has ever seen them. No one has followed those links. They don't matter. They're just like detritus on the internet. So I might have a high degree, but not actually matter. And I guess the genius behind PageRank was to think like, okay, well, what we want is not just how many links you have, but like, how likely is it that I am to arrive at your site in particular if I follow a random path through the network? The idea being that like people they don't randomly click on links, but it's not a bad estimation of how they follow up their inquiries and follow up their patterns of attention. So in the paper, we distinguish PageRank in and PageRank out. Can you explain the difference between those two and why both of them would be interesting in different ways?
Yeah, so PageRank out is what we use to figure out who might be like a good epistemic source of information. So who is it that you should be listening to? And this would be someone who, if you tweet, whose tweet would tend to be retweeted by a large audience, right? So if you have a tweet, you send it out, what's the likelihood that that is going to reach a large number of people? And so the higher that likelihood, the higher than your PageRank out is, and you're more likely to be a good source of information because a lot of people are relying on that information in the network. And then high PageRank in is a well-positioned like receiver. So someone who you're a well-positioned receiver if you're receiving this good information. So PageRank in would be the user tends to retweet more messages, drawing on a wide range of sources, right? So you're drawing a wider range of sources that you then have a high PageRank in.
Yeah, so I guess the idea is something like if I, as an individual, want to benefit from the wisdom of crowds, then I want to get messages from lots of people who are different from each other. So my PageRank in should be high. And if I want to sort of be an influential person in the network, then I want to make sure that lots of different people in lots of different places in the network are likely to see my message. So I want to have high PageRank out. And we computed this, and it was a little bit troubling because in both studies, the network was very polarized. There were like half of the nodes were very anti-vax and half of the nodes were very pro-vaccine.
Yeah, it was wasn't it like the exact same number? So it was like
in the first one, it was like 91 and 93.
Yeah, so
yeah, they're almost exactly the same.
Yeah.
And the second one, it was pretty similar as well. And so already it's polarized, but on top of that, like the anti-vaxxers, especially one node in particular, had much higher PageRank out, but also higher PageRank in. And it was like, I just remember looking at this and thinking like, people treat PageRank as a measure not just of being trusted, but of being trustworthy. And those are two different things. And it looks like in this network, at least, and we studied it twice, PageRank doesn't actually optimize for trustworthiness. It optimizes for something else. Any thoughts about why that happened?
Yeah, so going back to the difference between the ideal and the non-ideal, right there we were drawing on a study that in ideal cases show that PageRank what is trustworthy, right? It does pick out true information. So applying it to a real case, well, is it trustworthy? Well, clearly no, because you get, I mean, we found the person with the highest PageRank out was someone who was just peddling a bunch of disinformation about vaccine safety. So it wasn't even someone who might have legitimate worries, right? But it's just complete disinformation.
It was like a
But then,
grifter, right?
yeah, I don't know. Yeah.
But I've been following this network subsequently, and they are still the highest ranked account.
Okay, yeah.
And they just use it to sell like natural foods and medicines. It's really upsetting, especially being in lockdown for 9 weeks now.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So then that might also be going back to what we're talking about, entering a discussion in good faith, right? So maybe this person isn't even entering the discussion in good faith. They're just trying to make money in these various MLM schemes or something. But yeah, but so if we ignore that one person,
acronym that refers to multi-level marketing, which is a kind of
yeah, like a pyramid, like the modern day pyramid scheme. Yeah. So but if we ignore that person, then the PageRank for people on the pro-vaccine side and the con-vaccine side, I mean, you don't really see very many differences. So it's just completely bivalent, right? So you're not going to, PageRank isn't going to be able to tell you whether or not you're in a trustworthy network or not.
Yeah, I mean, it was interesting in a way that the highest PageRank person in the pro-vaccine camp was the president of the Australian Medical Association, right? So it does seem like it did actually pick out someone who is trustworthy in that case. But when you have these polarized networks, it's like, if you're lucky enough to find yourself on the right polarity, you can use it. But if you are unlucky and you find yourself on the wrong polarity, then you end up getting attracted precisely to things that you shouldn't believe.
Right. Yeah, so in these non-ideal cases, then PageRank just isn't going to be decisive enough, right, to pick out the wisdom of crowds, because in some communities you'll converge on wrong answers compared to other ones.
Yeah, so I guess this relates to some of the stuff that is in the book that I've also assigned for this week by Hugo Mercier, called Not Born Yesterday. One of the things that he says is a reasonable heuristic when someone presents you with information is to ask whether it's consistent with other things you already believe. And that seems right. I mean, if you come along and tell me like that you're a dinosaur, probably not going to believe you. But the problem is, like, once you acquire enough false beliefs, especially if they're inferentially connected to each other, it becomes very hard to extract yourself from that, and very easy to end up with even more false beliefs that are consistent with those. And I kind of feel like that's what we see with these two studies, is that there are certain people who are already accepting of, or at least sympathetic to, anti-vax views, and then someone comes along and tells them something else that's anti-vax, and they think, yeah, that makes sense, and they adopt that as well, and then you're kind of off to the races.
Yeah, exactly.
Which I guess relates to other stuff in Mercier's book. So in a way, he's got a very optimistic take. He thinks like demagogues and prophets and propagandists and advertisers are generally ineffective because people can figure out that they've got non-epistemic interests when they make pronouncements. So he points out, like, even during World War II, most Germans were skeptical of Hitler. And he says, like, you know, this shows that people can tell that when you say something, you might have an ulterior motive for your audience to adopt the belief, and not actually just being trying to inform them, and that we're actually pretty good as a species at detecting that kind of phenomenon. So on the one hand, that's interesting and provocative, and I think partially right. But on the other hand, we also see these phenomena where people end up adopting wild conspiracy theories, like the QAnon conspiracy theory, or Trump's big lie about how the election was stolen from him in 2020. Or, I mean, just the other day, I was reading about these people who reject vaccines in the United States and instead are ingesting horse deworming medicines, which is sending them to the hospital, unsurprisingly. So it seems like sometimes this kind of propaganda and misinformation is quite effective. And I wonder, like, how to reconcile these two views, that, like, we are sensitive to whether someone has ulterior motives, whether they want us to believe something just so that they can make money off of us or take advantage of us in some other way. And on the other hand, people being obviously susceptible to that in some cases.
Yeah, and I think that part of this has to do with the way that social media works, right? So oftentimes on social media, you're following people that you trust, right? So
why would you follow them otherwise, right?
Right, yeah. So these are like your friends, your family, right? And if all of a sudden your feed is filled with the same type of misinformation, you're going to give it more of a hearing because it's coming from people that you trust. And then if you see it enough, well, we also have other biases that if you see something a lot, right, you're more likely to then believe it. Right. So I think that there is this other dynamic going on with social media that's different, that can be different from these other kinds of cases. I mean, it's not, in some ways, right, there's going to be more gullible people than other gullible people. So you always hear about the cases of the person getting sent to the hospital, but you don't hear about the cases of all the people who said, no, that's ridiculous, right? But as we can see, there has been a lot of harm that's coming from this type of propaganda that's being disseminated. And some of the harm is more subtle, right? So some of the harm, I think maybe a large part of the harm, is that people now can't even have a conversation with someone with a different opinion in the way that maybe we were able to do before. That it really has like fragmented society such that compromises of any kind are just seen as losing or winning, right? And so that's a kind of more subtle harm that I think has really happened from this.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it was years in the making, as these things tend to be, but that sounds right, that it's not clear that, for instance, in the United States, people even live in a society anymore. There's sort of two societies living side by side. And that's in part because trust has broken down so far that this kind of bipolar network that we also detect on social media is present in people's everyday lives. So in some ways, I think that the focus on social media is a bit of a distraction. And I think like this has been happening on the ground in lots of ways for years. And it's just easier to study it online because if I want to figure out like what is the network of people listening to the radio, I can't get that data. But if I want to track like who follows whom on Twitter and who retweets whom on Twitter, I can do that. So that's what researchers do. So this is a very pessimistic thing to end on, but do you think that there are hopes for, let's not say making things fine or right or good, but making things less bad?
On social media?
Or in our contemporary social epistemic networks that include social media and all the other connections we have?
Yeah, so I think that with social media in particular, and it might have like a trickling down effect, is that it needs to, the practices that are happening on it just need to be revised, right? So they are like purposefully like manipulative and to keep you on the platform. And it should be that there are just certain things that we know are manipulative that maybe like they can't do. So one thing is the bottomless scroll, right? So it used to be, this was invented by someone. So it used to be that when you go onto like a web page, you had to press like the next button, right? It stopped at a certain point. But there's been a whole bunch of studies that if you have like the never-ending bowl of cereal, right, you're going to eat way more cereal than you would have, and you might feel sick afterwards. Or, bottomless margaritas, right? You drink way more than is appropriate than if you were only to say, okay, no, you just get the one margarita and you have to keep paying extra each time. So just getting rid of the bottomless scroll, say on Twitter or Facebook, maybe people would consume less and be less addictive, right? And maybe it's just like a simple regulation that then people might do other kinds of activities, right? So there might be other kinds of things that you can do to kind of promote epistemic values in particular for truth, but also other kinds of values as well. So values of like community building or something like that, that we just need to kind of think about. I mean, there is that, gosh, I don't know what it's called. Is it like the Center for Humane Technology or something, where they're trying to tackle with these kinds of problems to make sure that technology is used for good instead of for bad.
Yeah, I mean, so I should say the bottomless soup studies do not replicate. That's the
Okay.
That's the Wayside stuff out of Pittsburgh, and he's now been drummed out of the discipline because he faked all his data.
Wow.
But the interesting thing is that he might be right, even though he faked his data. It might be one of these weird sort of cases where someone had the correct hypothesis, but they didn't bother to actually establish it in the right way. So I wouldn't say like don't believe it, but I would say there isn't much evidence for it at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, right. So, but one thing to keep in mind though is that these companies do like this, what they call A/B testing all the time that you're not aware of. So they break users into groups like the A group and the B group, maybe might be even more groups, and they just change one thing about the page and they see how it affects behavior, right? Yeah. And they go with the one that increases the behavior that they want.
Yeah.
Right. So
and that behavior is usually like staying on the site, clicking on things, scrolling, mousing over, that kind of stuff.
So this is just a very curious thing. I would be really curious to know why Google doesn't adopt a bottomless scroll, because there's a reason. And I'd like to know what it is.
That's an interesting question. So I've seen studies that suggest not only that the vast majority of Google searches end before someone clicks to the next 10 results, like 11 through 20, but that actually the vast majority end before they even scroll down to the last 4. Because normally on like a normal browser, you can see 5 or 6. So there must be something to that ease of use that they're trying to optimize, where people feel like, yeah, I'm going to get the right answer immediately, and then I'm off to the races. And maybe that has to do with advertising revenue. I don't really know.
Yeah.
Well, we're probably not going to find out from them, given their recent behavior with respect to their ethics advisory groups. But it would be interesting if some governments could get involved and force them to explain themselves.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree.
Emily, I really thank you for your time. I appreciate this. It's been nice to see you again from halfway around the world. And hopefully we'll get to do this again before too long.
Yeah, it's been fun. I hope it's been helpful for people as well.
I'm sure it is. Thanks.